everyone, it's Sevi. As a break from my usual guide videos, I'm doing a video essay about the seemingly intimidating or frightening or joy-sucking concept that is the Genshin meta, in the hopes of making it seem friendlier to the wider player base. Now, I certainly don't consider myself the master of meta out there, especially since meta in gaming has been applied mainly to competitive games, which I never really got into. Instead, treat this video as coming from a content creator and guide maker who is trying to make meta concepts more accessible and usable to a more casual audience. There's also a lot of nuance and complexity when it comes to this topic, which won't be covered in a single essay. But I'm hoping that for players who began as a casual player like me, this can serve as a primer to the meta side of Genshin Impact. First, what is the meta? In the world of competitive gaming, the established meaning of meta is the best strategies to achieve a certain goal. In the case of PvP games like League of Legends or Valorant, the goal is carrying your team to victory by outsmarting and overpowering your opponents. There's actually a very simple acronym which players generally use as its definition: most efficient/effective tactics available. It's a convenient and direct way to put it. You select certain characters, use certain equipment, apply certain tactics and the like because they have been proven to be advantageous in particular scenarios. And given that other players are applying their own strategy, it becomes a game of knowing how to counter and have a better strategy, which again involves a deeper understanding of the meta. But Genshin is not like that. It has no competitive or PvP aspect, aside from the ones we artificially create, like fan-hosted tournaments. And it's also unlike some gacha games which have an actual in-game leaderboard. For example, in Genshin Impact or Punishing Grey Raven, you can, in a sense, compete with players by getting points for how efficiently you can beat certain battle modes. There are still in-game rewards in Genshin that offer incentives for you to basically get good, Primogems being the most enticing of them all. But there's no strategy necessary to outsmart other players, only what's in the game itself. So, what is the Genshin meta if there's no sense of competition? Does that mean that the game really has no meta in the first place? Not quite. Again, we can simplify meta as the best strategies to achieve a certain goal. But what is the goal in Genshin? In essence, you collect and build characters, overcome battles of various difficulties, and eventually progress through the game's events. For all players, these are our goals, but there is a distinction to be made with how different types of players approach them. This is a gacha game for waifus and husbandos, and at the end of the day, you can just pull whoever you like because they will get you through most of the game's content. Genshin's story battles are made so that very casual players will get through them easily enough as long as you put some effort into leveling up characters and creating decent teams. It's when we start considering more difficult fights like higher level domains, challenging combat, Spiral Abyss, or even certain achievements that you develop an ever-increasing understanding of what is more effective against certain scenarios, or the meta. We may even deliberately try to get and build characters. It's not just because you subjectively like them, but because you think they are better investments to make the game easier. We may realize certain strategies, characters, and team combinations for the same reason. These don't mean we're already hardcore meta Genshin players, but that's just us gravitating towards what is meta in practice. When we hear about what's meta in Genshin, it's usually used to label or categorize. When we say Xiangling is meta-defining, it's because, as a pyro character with the right teammates, she has objectively proven herself to be able to achieve higher DPS output in AoE scenarios versus her pyro peers. And her potential has only been maintained until today, even with all the changes to Spiral Abyss. Add to that she's a free-to-play 4-star character that, with enough investment, can match or outperform other 5-star alternatives, which is amazing returns for such an accessible unit. And so, when people tell you to invest in Xiangling because she's meta, there's a good reason for that. Xiangling is such an easy pick for helping clear difficult content.
This is the one that's really going to sizzle old Slugworth.
What's it do?
Would you like to see?
Yeah.
Then, certain team comps are deemed meta because of how good their synergy and team DPS are in relation to other teams. Going back to Xiangling, her most meta team, and one of Genshin's meta teams, is none other than the Timeless National Team, which unsurprisingly is also composed of established meta units. You can put random characters together and they'll get you through the game's quests for sure, but you can't expect to bring that lack of strategy when facing harder content, unless maybe you've wailed so hard on your characters that proper team comps become almost completely irrelevant. Certain team comps or formats have established themselves as very effective damage dealers, even despite the always changing abyss and new monsters added. Then, when we say a build is meta, it's because that build has undergone practical testing and simulated calculations, and, given controlled setups and certain conditions, are found to be more advantageous to use than other builds. Like simply how Raiden's meta build is the 4-piece emblem, because it's tailor-fit and given equal artifact quality, it just beats other artifacts significantly. Part of the meta is also understanding the more complex inner workings of the game and how to exploit them. Things like creating optimal rotations, balancing character stats, knowing efficient attack combos. These are part of knowing how to play the game's meta mechanics. We do indeed see that what is meta can always potentially shift via updates or new mechanics. Take the 1.6 reaction buffs, for example, which gave a significant boost to transformative reactions. And on the cusp of Sumeru's arrival, what better way to shake up the current meta than to introduce the 7th element, Dendro, with new interactions that might breathe new life into existing elements. Maybe it will even make certain current characters more meta and create new meta builds, but then comes the next question. Who determines what is meta? Well, it's a combination of the general player base and those we refer to as theory crafters or TCs. For the wider community, we usually form a consensus that gets reinforced, that X is better than this or Y is best in that. We use a mix of personal experience, professional sources, peer testimonies, and hearsay to form the basis of our claims. Of course, the level of understanding and cognitive bias always varies from player to player, and because of that, there's bound to be inconsistencies in claims. So, to create a more organized approach to defining what is meta, we have TCs who use more mathematical and logical modes of analyses. It's more objective, as it should rely on a more scientific method rather than just gut feeling. Really, it's such a huge help that they're doing a lot of hard work that the community can greatly benefit from.
I couldn't think of a more horrible job if I wanted to. And you have to do it. You have to.
Speaking of theory crafters, I plan to do a longer in-depth podcast discussion of this topic with my TC friend and maths guy Migo, who's been helping me put out good info. Here's a link to his Twitch. Catch him live for fun streams with excellent Genshin advice. Anyway, it's a different discussion as to whether TC knowledge will be accessible or accepted by the general community. Sometimes, information may be hard for players to digest because it's not presented as accessible enough, which is why more casual players will often turn to their more meta friends to give them shorthand recommendations. And this is completely understandable, and it's also why Genshin guide makers and content exist. But certain meta info may not always be relevant to a player because they don't need it. Cognitive bias will also affect how a player receives or views reliable information. Information gets garbled, used to reinforce biases, decontextualized, or plain transformed into misinformation, and so on. All these contribute to why there are inconsistencies as to what is agreed on by the Genshin community as meta or not. There's also some hostility towards theory crafters or TC-based information because to some, it might feel like if they're not doing exactly what is meta recommended, then they're being criticized. While I understand that feeling, I think that theory crafting is just intrinsically neutral. It just presents the method, evidence, arguments, and findings. Say that an evidence-based claim posits that this character performs worse than another character. It's not a personal attack on someone who likes said character. It's just that, objectively speaking, there is a gap in power or utility. It's when some, not the TCs themselves even, may weaponize that information to pressure or make you feel bad for playing the non-meta way that it becomes hostile towards more casual players. Then that breeds animosity towards any mention of the meta. This seems to create the perception that there's a gap or barrier between more casual, easygoing players and the meta aspect of Genshin Impact, which I don't think is exactly true. Because whatever kind of player you are, we naturally will gravitate to some extent towards what's optimal or effective, which is already the road to the game's meta. I want to promote the mindset that trying to be aware of the meta doesn't have to take away from enjoying the game, nor is it a field that requires you to be a mathematical genius, nor does it make you a meta slave. There's a lot more nuance involved if you really choose to get behind the scenes, but the meta can be accessible and pragmatically learned to benefit any type of player. So why learn the meta? One aspect is to manage the game's difficulty. Game design tries to combine the aspects of being fun and challenging. For hardcore veteran players, Genshin Impact might be easy, but for those who aren't, the game might be challenging or difficult at times. Where these thresholds land depend on the player. But one thing that knowing the meta can allow a player to do is to better surpass that difficulty level. Learning what characters are highly valuable will help your selection roster. Learning optimal builds will make them even stronger. Learning how to manipulate reactions and team synergies can make battles less difficult. I know a lot of players become dead set on getting particular characters because of their designs, stories, personalities, etc., and I do too. And once that character comes home, the next question is how to build and use that character in order to bring out their best potential, which involves knowing the meta build and team and also what's off meta. This then becomes a pathway to making increasingly harder content more doable. And Spiral Abyss has been the game's consistent measure of how well you can apply character building, team comps, and gameplay skill, or a measure of how much you've wailed to make your character stronger so that mastery of the game's content becomes less relevant. But even those aren't mutually exclusive, as relying on wailing without a certain level of skill and mastery is still making the game harder for you than it needs to be. Conversely, you can spend less or nothing at all, but because you know how to better maximize your limited resources, you'll still clear difficult content well enough. The other more practical and material aspect is to empower you as a more conscious consumer. As a gacha game whose business model is composed of building hype and marketing to profit from its players and fans, Genshin cannot be separated from its economic aspect. In-game, Genshin's resources are capped to an extent, specifically through its resin limit unless you pay for more resin. So where do we spend that resin on? If you view Genshin as an endless activity, you will accumulate enough resources to farm for every character that you're interested in. But I think there's value in giving tips for resource and time efficiency, like when we say that an artifact domain is more resin efficient. Outside of the game, Hoyoverse will do a lot to get players to spend money. Genshin is definitely winnable as a free-to-play, yes, but there's no denying that whales do reap the rewards of, well, whaling. Many in the player base, though, will opt to budget their spending on the game or just not spend at all, and for the vast majority of their experience, work with whatever Genshin's gacha gods gives them. And what does one do when they're on a tight budget? They do research to make informed decisions about what they want to buy or invest in. Or alternatively, if they do invest in something, how to make that thing have the best returns. You can certainly still choose to dump your Primogems on whatever you just feel like, but there's also merit in factoring in wiser choices. This can even be done at whatever stage of the game you're in. Even if you're a new player, it's a very simple question to ask. Which characters are good? In the same way that when players try out a new game, we want to get an idea of what's a good way to start the experience. Meta-recommended options can be shared initially, and from there, the player can keep refining their knowledge of what's okay, good, better, and best. Understanding those recommendations helps with opportunity cost and return of investment, since Genshin's ecosystem is heavily based on limited currency. Some higher spenders won't feel its effects as badly, but for low spenders or free-to-play players, they might sometimes ask, what is the best bang for your buck? Who's worth investing in? What can I sink my primos and resources into that will net me the highest returns possible in terms of helping me clear content efficiently? Ultimately, learning the meta in Genshin can be seen as becoming a more informed buyer/player. At the very least, you have a better idea of what you're gaining if you follow the meta, or what you're alternatively getting if you don't. It also helps us to avoid overvaluing or underestimating a character, and consequently avoiding buyer's remorse if ever. You can always say waifu over meta, but to be truly waifu over meta, you have to have some understanding of what constitutes the meta. And when you you do, choosing waifu at the end of the day becomes a more meaningful choice. So, if the meta is this useful, then why is there animosity towards it? I think one reason is that it might seem too complicated to even bother with, and as a consequence, it no longer makes the game fun, which I think doesn't have to be the case. Maybe some get overzealous or judgmental at correcting players, which in turn leads to antagonizing them. On the other hand, some may unreasonably take offense at even politely worded factual pieces of advice because it goes against what they're doing, which is just as bad. But ultimately, the meta isn't something casual players should be scared of, and it's not something that not casual players should use to dunk on others. It shouldn't be an if you're not playing meta, you're a trash player, or if you play by the meta, then you're a meta slave. The way I hope the meta would be better seen is as a guide that exists if you need something to make the game easier or more manageable, whether in terms of content difficulty, budgeting, or resource allocation. If you're at least aware of these, then you know what to expect if you are consciously diverging from it, and that's fine. Furthermore, it might seem cold and intimidating. Like the scientific method, it has to be based on evidence that can be proven or disputed, which might take a lot of argumentation, comparative analysis, maths, and Excel sheets. But if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. Advice ought to be backed up, reviewed, and most importantly, revised if needed. That's where communicators, streamers, or content creators can help too. They help create spaces to make meta concepts digestible to players, and it doesn't necessarily have to look like rocket science for it to still be considered as meta-based. Unless they genuinely want to, the general player base doesn't really need to know the nitty-gritties of methodologies, calculations, or hidden mechanics of why something is a meta recommendation. It's always good if they do, but that's time consuming and I know we have better things to do. What's more reasonable is how they can practically benefit and immediately apply such things. What is the most helpful info for me without making it all too complicated? That's always a fair question. And so assessing what my audience really needs and wants to know first is an important consideration. But if you're willing and able to gradually learn more complex concepts in the game, like I'm continuously doing, then you might find that it will make your Genshin experience all the more interesting and rewarding. And ultimately, you'll be able to arrive at your own analyses and conclusions as well that you can verify, share, and cross-check with others to help create a healthier, enjoyable, and more informed community.
The Genshin meta
is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Is it possible to learn this power?
Those are some of my thoughts on the Genshin meta from a content creator, guide maker perspective, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. There's definitely so much more to talk about and a lot more questions and points I've yet to cover. Again, I'll be hosting a podcast together with Migo on my Twitch channel sometime soon, so if you enjoyed this discussion, follow my Twitch and Twitter for future announcements of when we'll have it, and maybe you can drop in there your questions too. If you're interested in watching my videos that simplify meta concepts, check out these videos, which I'll link in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel for more Genshin Impact guides and content, and I will see you all soon. Take care!